Good morning, everyone. All right, so my name is Sara, and I'm a freelance front-end web developer. I'm based in Lebanon, but I usually work with companies across the globe. I'm usually the front-end developer that is brought into a team of designers and other developers, usually designers plus back-end developers, and I bridge the gap between the two. I'm brought into projects usually in the design phase, so I get to give feedback about certain design decisions and how they're going to affect the UX and the accessibility of the interface. Sometimes I'm brought into the design, into a project after all of the design decisions have been made, and I have to do with whatever I've been given and try to make sure that I build interfaces or the design that I have been given to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. Now, about 4 years ago, I did not know anything about accessibility. I didn't even hear the word accessibility until one day, I think it was over on Twitter, I heard the word for the first time. I wasn't really sure what it was, and then I heard it a couple more times, and it was from people that I learn a lot from. So that piqued my interest a lot, and so I started following more people that were doing accessibility work. I started reading what they were writing and learning a lot from them. And learning about accessibility has, before I learned about accessibility, just like a lot of people, I was building not completely inaccessible, but very partially inaccessible experiences before that, including for client projects. And when I learned about accessibility and how important it is, I felt ashamed, and I knew that I had the responsibility because nobody wants their interfaces to not be usable, right? So learning about the fundamentals of accessibility has fundamentally changed the way I look at a design, the way I see a design, and it has changed the way I think and the way I approach building UI components. Now, in this talk, I want to share some of the things that I learned over the last few years, very few things because we only have 40 minutes. And I hope that from this talk, you will be able to pick up some tips that you can take away and use in your projects right away to make them as accessible as possible. So this is going to be a very practical talk with a lot of practical information. Now, at the foundation of every accessible website is semantic markup. Semantic HTML is descriptive HTML. So each HTML element describes the type of content that it creates. If you have a heading, you use a heading tag. If you have a paragraph, you use a paragraph. Lists, you use lists, etc. In other words, it means using the correct HTML element for their correct purpose as much as possible. Now, in design, I'm talking about visual design here, headings define visual hierarchy. Areas and white space on the page are used to indicate which content is the main content and which content is complementary. A sighted user can get a clear skeleton of the page quickly by scanning it, just by looking at it. But a non-sighted user cannot do that. So how do you provide the same hierarchies, the same skeleton of a page to the non-sighted user with HTML semantics? Using HTML5 sectioning elements and proper headings, sectioning elements and proper headings is important because it's going to allow your screen reader users to get a similar skeleton of the page that a sighted user can get, allowing them to navigate the page more easily. They can skip the areas that they don't want and jump straight to the areas that they do want and need very easily and very quickly. Now, screen reader users usually, and this is one of the most important things that I've learned, they use what is known as a rotor to navigate the web page. The rotor is like power users or power commands, but for screen reader users. It increases their efficiency and facilitates their browsing the web. Now, using the rotor, and if the document is using semantic markup and proper sectioning elements such as nav, header, main, footer, aside, etc., the user can move from one area of the page to another without having to go through the content in each section. And it is very important for them to be able to do so. But the document structure in the rotor is defined by the document structure in your HTML. So if you don't provide a heading, it's not going to show up in the headings menu. If you don't use the main landmark or the aside or the nav landmark, it's not going to show up in their menu. And so they're not going to be able to use them. Let me jump straight to this fun video. It's a video game style video that shows the importance of using proper headings and landmarks and links to facilitate.
Bing, the search engine, responds.
I found a site that can...
Animation in the style of an 8-bit video game. Woman in room.
Hope has spent all day preparing a surprise party for her son's birthday.
Oh no! I forgot the cake! I'd better get online and find a bakery fast!
Hope rushes to her PC to search for a solution.
Bing, the search engine, responds.
I found a site that can help you out.
The Bingo Bakery website appears. Hope spawns at the top of the page. The Bing logo as a character with googly eyes descends.
Here we are. Nice site, isn't it?
I guess, but I can't really tell. I have trouble seeing well, and it looks like this site has very limited accessibility.
Really? Let me take a look with the lights out.
A pull cord swings down. Bing pulls it to turn up the lights.
Bingo Bakery. Homepage.
There's nothing to land on!
Hope falls and loses a life.
Oh, I see what you mean. Let me see what the developers can do about this.
A pop-up menu appears. The difficulty level changes from impossible to challenging. Hope spawns again at the top of the page. Bing descends.
Sorry about that. Here, take this developer power-up.
A pop-up menu with an image of shoes and the code for tabbing appears.
These shoes of tabbing will allow you to move from tab to tab on the page. Good luck, and make haste.
Bing ascends out of frame. The shoes of tabbing flash onto Hope's feet. The lights go out again. All page tabs are visible.
Bingo Bakery. Homepage. 18 links.
Okay, I've got 18 links. I wonder how many I'll have to jump through to get where I need to go.
Hope jumps to a link.
Just a quick heads up. The announcements that you hear, those are the screen reader announcements. So they announce the number of links, and in the upcoming 2 sections, they will also announce the number of headings and any landmarks available.
Services.
Nope, that's not what I'm looking for. I need a ready-made cake.
A timer counts down.
Catering. Locations. Contact. Style. List with 3 options.
Hope climbs down the list.
Square. Pan sheet. Flavor. List with 3 options. Chocolate. White. Spice.
This seems like a build-your-own-cake section. I don't have time for that. I just want a pre-made cake.
Frosting. List with 3 options.
Time is up. The bakery is closed. Hope loses a life. She has 2 left. Image of a closed sign. Bing appears.
Goodness, this is harder than it should be. Let me see if the developers can help again.
A pop-up menu appears. The difficulty level changes from challenging to inefficient. Hope spawns again at the top of the page. Bing descends.
Still having trouble? Here, try this developer bonus.
A pop-up menu with an image of a technical device and the code for landmarks.
This landmark teleportation device will allow you to teleport to landmarks on the page. Good luck, and make haste.
Bing ascends out of frame. The teleportation device flashes onto Hope's wrist. The lights go out. All page tabs and landmarks are visible.
Bingo Bakery. Homepage. 18 links. 4 landmarks.
Okay, let's see what's on this page.
Hope teleports.
Navigation landmark. List with 6 items. Bingo. Homepage button.
Okay, that's where I am now. What's next?
Main landmark. List with 11 items. Style link.
Well, that was a nice jump.
Hope jumps.
Flavor. List with 3 options. Frosting. List with 3 options. More. Birthday. List with 2 options.
Is this a pre-made cake section?
Hope climbs.
Image of a round cake with happy birthday written on top. Flavor. White. Frosting. Vanilla. Decoration. Red.
Yes, this is it.
Time is up. The bakery is booked full. Hope loses a life. She has 1 left. Image of a booked order form. Bing appears.
Getting closer. Let me see if the developers have anything else up their sleeves.
A pop-up menu. The difficulty level changes from inefficient to effortless. Hope spawns again at the top of the page. Bing descends.
You almost made it that time. Here's one more developer gift that can help you out.
A pop-up menu with an image of a gun and the code for headings.
This grappling gun of headings will allow you to swing 2 headings on the page. Good luck, and make haste.
Bing ascends out of frame. The gun flashes into Hope's hand. The lights go out. All page tabs, landmarks, and headings are visible.
Bingo Bakery. Homepage. 18 links. 4 landmarks. 3 headings.
All right, this is my last chance. I have to make it this time.
Hope teleports.
Navigation landmark. List with 6 items. Bingo. Homepage button. Main landmark. List with 14 items. Build your own heading.
Okay, what's the next heading?
Hope shoots and grapples to the next heading.
Pre-made cakes.
Yes, here we are.
Hope jumps.
Birthday. List with 2 options.
Hope climbs.
Image of a round cake with happy birthday written on top.
That's the one.
Checkout. Time. List with 2 options. Now.
Yes.
Billing. List with 3 options. Cash on delivery.
Yes, please.
Hope jumps to finish button with 1 second remaining. Image of bakery interior as baker hands Hope a cake. Hope is jubilant. Bing appears.
Congratulations, you've ordered your cake in the nick of time.
Hope is back in her house.
Gee, happy Having those extra accessibility options sure made that faster and more enjoyable. I never would have got this cake in time for the party without them.
Text of accessibility coding.
Accessibility navigation is a piece of cake.
Text displays. The cake is not a lie. Pixelated Microsoft logo.
My favorite part is always the last pun. It's accessibility is a piece of cake. Even though in real life it's not really a piece. So this sounds pretty straightforward, right? So we have HTML. HTML5 provides us with sectioning elements, main, nav, aside, etc. And we have headings with heading levels that can be used to define the document hierarchy, similar to the visual hierarchy for sighted users or for non-sighted users. But things aren't always as simple or as straightforward as they sound. So what if the design specification says that you don't have a heading somewhere on the page, and a sighted user is able to tell what the content on the page is just by looking at other elements on the page. So we don't really need a heading sometimes. So what do you do in that case? So the sighted user or the design in general does not need a heading, but what about non-sighted users? So in a project that I'm currently working on, I had a couple of interesting scenarios like these. Now, that's the video that I just played. So the first one is something like this. I had to hide the logo and the navigation because it's still a top secret. It's one of my favorite projects. I can't wait for it to go live. So in this first simple scenario, I have a few page templates that simply didn't have any headings associated with the main section of the page. A page listing a series of articles like this one had the description on top, that piece of text, which is also, by the way, this is all random content, not real content. The sighted user can tell what the articles are about and how they are related, especially since the logo, with this design, the logo helps with that. So kind of the topic of the page is kind of part of the logo, but that's a whole different story for a different talk. So a sighted user can tell what these articles here are, what their title is, but a non-sighted user does not really have a heading in this page. Now, I built the basic structure of the page without a heading at first. But then when I navigated the page using the Rotor, which in this case I'm using VoiceOver on macOS, I noticed this. So the heading structure shows you all of the headings menu inside of the Rotor, shows you all of the headings on the page. So I have a list of H2s there, and then a couple of H3s and a couple more H2s. This is not very helpful because a document structure needs to have all levels of headings. So I have a list of H2s, but they don't belong anywhere. They don't belong to a specific title. So how are these H2s related? And then when I use the Rotor again to navigate using landmarks, this is in VoiceOver on Chrome, macOS, not Safari. Quick tip, whenever you want to test your interfaces using VoiceOver, use it with Safari, because Safari is optimized for VoiceOver and vice versa. And usually screen reader users who use VoiceOver, they will know to use Safari. But you want to test it in all possible, just like we do cross-browser testing, basically. So in VoiceOver on Chrome was using that whole paragraph as a title for my main area. So if the user was navigating, it would announce banner, it would announce a main navigation, I have the pagination, etc. But then before announcing the main section, it reads out all that long paragraph, which could be this long, and it's going to use that as a title for my main section, and that is not very efficient. Now, the fix in this particular case was simple. Both navigations were messed up because the main section was missing a heading. In the headings, I didn't have an H1, and the main section in the navigation landmarks also didn't have a heading. And since the design does not allow having a visible heading, I added a heading that's only exposed to screen readers like this. So we will talk more about hiding content accessibly in the next section. I'll talk a lot about it. But for now, it's enough to say that this class name, which is SR only, which is short for screen reader only, it's a utility class that applies styles to my heading that hides this piece of text visually while making sure that it's still accessible to screen readers. So I have a heading in there. My screen reader is going to use that. It's going to show up in the Rotor menu. It's going to use it as a title for my main section. All good. Now, adding a title to sections where one was missing is straightforward, but then there were also instances where it looked like I didn't have a heading, but I kind of did. So another template, or a few other templates on the website, looked something like this. Again, I have a section with a list of articles, I have a paragraph that describes what these articles are, and then I have some sort of a sidebar on the left side. It says, there's a heading that says resources tagged with, and then it shows you the tag that they are tagged with. And then I have a list of other popular topics. initially, my first gut reaction, I wouldn't say gut reaction, my first reaction was something like this. So I needed to lay this out on the page. First look, I knew I would lay the paragraph on its own box, and then the box for the sidebar, and then a box for the main section. All of these would be part of the main element on the page. All good. So I would have an aside here and a section with a list of articles. Now, I know that navigating using landmarks and headings, something weird was going to happen, and was going to be because of this part here. So this little heading, it has multiple problems. The first one is, if I'm going to translate the design exactly as it is into code, I would have a heading inside of my markup that says resources tagged with. That's an incomplete heading. It's a useless heading. And if that shows up in the headings menu inside of my Rotor, it doesn't really tell my screen reader users anything. It's not complete. So the first thing to note here is that generative, the word generative, which does not look like it's part of the heading, is actually part of the heading, even if it doesn't look like it is. So when I marked this up, I knew that I would have to have a heading. I'm not thinking about the heading level yet. So a heading that says resources tagged with generative, and then I can wrap the generative part in a span and then give it a display block, change its style so it looks like this, but under the hood, it's part of the heading. So good, now I have a heading that shows up in my headings menu. That's good. But what is it doing in the sidebar now? So if this is a heading inside of my sidebar, what is it a heading of? There's no content that belongs to it. And then I have another heading underneath it with some content that belongs to it. But what is this doing here? And then if you look at the design of the page, you'll notice that as a sighted user, you know that the resources on the right, all of those articles, they are the result of clicking the generative tag somewhere. So this is the result of, so these articles are the resources, all of the articles that are tagged with the generative, which means that this heading here is actually the heading of my main section. So, a couple of things to note here. Because it's the heading of my main section, it should not belong inside of an aside element, inside of a sidebar, because aside is complementary information, but this is main content. And the second thing to note here is because this is the heading of my main section, it's going to be an H1 of the page. And then I have all of the article headings underneath that H1 or belonging to that H1. So even though it doesn't look like an H1, it's still an H1 under the hood. So the whole thing is a heading, even if it doesn't look like one. It's an H1, even if it doesn't look like one. And it does not belong in the sidebar, even if it's visually positioned inside of it. So what started out as a different way of separating content ended up being like this, and the code is something like this. So I have my main section on the page. The H1, of course, goes inside of the main section, but I wanted to highlight it, so I put it outside. But the H1 is part of the main section. Now, there's something else that I'm doing here. Because VoiceOver on Chrome was using that paragraph as a main title for my main area, I wanted to avoid that, to fix that. So I gave my heading an ID, and then I told the screen reader that the main section is labeled by this ID, using aria labeled by. So aria labeled by is used to tell the screen reader that this element that I'm using it on, in this case it's my main section, this element is labeled by some other element or by more than one element, just a side note. So, and now when a screen reader user navigates my page using the landmarks menu, they see something like this. So they see a banner, main navigation, resources tagged with generative, main, my main section, and all of the other landmarks. And if I use the headings menu, I have it looking like this. So I have an H1 that says resources tagged with generative, and then all of my resources, the articles that are tagged with generative, and then a few other headings on the page. So the main takeaways here are use HTML5 landmarks. They are very, very important because they allow your screen readers to navigate from one area of the page to another quickly and more efficiently. Provide headings where needed and follow headings order on the page. Even if it doesn't look like an H1, doesn't mean that it's not an H1. Don't skip headings. If a heading looks smaller, use the appropriate heading level in the HTML and make it smaller using CSS. And if the heading is to be visually hidden, provide one for screen reader users. Now, a survey of screen reader users, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, showed that 80% of respondents will use regions to navigate, but they can only do so if you choose to use them, those landmarks, instead of wrapping everything inside of divs. When you don't use semantic HTML elements, you take away your user's ability to navigate your content, which can cause a lot of frustration and counterproductivity. So I don't know if you've heard, if you know her, Leonie Watson is one of my favorite accessibility experts. She is a blind, disabled web developer. And in a video that she did with Smashing Magazine, she showed how she navigates a website using the screen reader. And generally speaking, they always, disabled users, screen reader users, will use both navigation landmarks and heading landmarks. Just like that woman that in the cake video did. So they use the landmarks to navigate to the main section or other sections on the page, and then inside of that landmark, they will use headings to go to whichever area that they want. Now, in addition to facilitating user navigation, using proper HTML semantics ensures that the user gets a clear idea of the elements that are on the page, what each one is, how they can interact with them by means of an accessibility tree. If you're a front-end developer or even a back-end developer, anyone who's into, let's say, accessibility developer, you need to be, the accessibility tree is the concept that you need to be familiar with and you need to know how it works. So the accessibility tree is a structure parallel to the DOM tree. For every meaningful, emphasis on meaningful, for every meaningful DOM element, an accessibility object is created and exposed to the user. Assistive technologies are going to use the accessibility tree to expose the content and information to the user. This is what it would normally look like. So the HTML that you write, which is here on the left, the HTML that you write is used to generate the DOM tree. And then the DOM tree is translated into the primary visual representation on the page, on top, and in parallel to the accessibility tree. So HTML, DOM, visual representation, and accessibility tree. But not everything that is presented visually is presented to screen readers. And sometimes you hide elements with CSS and it hides them to screen readers from screen readers. And sometimes it's the other way around. So you would have something hidden visually, but it's still part of the accessibility tree, just like we did with the heading before. So the accessibility tree is a subset of the DOM tree, and it is affected by both the markup and the styles applied to the DOM. The reason I said meaningful HTML elements before is that only an element that has semantics is going to show up in the accessibility tree. Divs and spans, they are semanticless, and so if you have a div and a span, and if you use them for anything on the page, they're not going to have an accessibility object, and they're not going to show up in the accessibility tree. So if you use a div to create a button, that button is not going to be accessible to screen readers, unless you do a lot of ARIA stuff that you shouldn't even have to do. Native HTML elements are implicitly mapped to accessibility APIs. For example, an image element will automatically be mapped to an accessibility node or object with a role of image and a label or a name based on the alt attribute, if present, and it should always be present. Similarly, other semantic native elements are exposed all together, forming an accessibility tree that looks something like this. So you can think of the accessibility tree as a tree of objects. An object is created for every meaningful HTML element, and that object may expose the name of that element, what it is, its role, like a button, for example, what its value is, what its current state is, so a checkbox can be checked or not checked, how it can be interacted with a space key and an enter key, etc. Your markup informs the objects that are created, and that's why using appropriate elements for content is extremely important to convey information to screen reader users. Now, it would be also very useful for us to be able to check what the accessibility tree looks like, right? So we can do that using the DevTools, and currently my favorite one is the accessibility panel inside of the Chrome DevTools. A simple button with a piece of text in it will show up in the DevTools as an object with a name inferred from the contents of the text and the role of a button. Because I'm using the button element, it's automatically going to show that the role of this element is button. The user knows how to interact with it because they know that they can press a button using the space key or using the enter key. And the name of that button is inferred from the piece of text inside of that button. So a screen reader would announce this. This is, again, VoiceOver on macOS. It's going to announce send message button. Now, the only reason this is announced like this is because I am using a button element with a piece of text inside of it. If I were using a div and not using any ARIA to change it or to give it semantics, it would not be announced as a button, and so it would not be accessible. Now, in this section, I want to talk about a specific kind of buttons, icon buttons. An icon button is an icon that triggers some sort of action on a page. More accurately and technically speaking, an icon button is a button that contains an icon and no visible accompanying text. We can see these buttons in most user interfaces today. Now, in an icon button, there is no text. visually speaking. The icon alone is supposed to convey meaning and thus function to the sighted user. Whether or not that's good UX is a completely different story. But what about screen reader users? How does an accessibility API expose such a button to the user? What name does it use for the button when there is no text inside of it? So it's going to have a role button, but what's the name? What's the accessible label for that? So the main reason I want to cover icon buttons is because in order to create them, we need to know two things: how to hide content accessibly and how to label content. So two very fundamental and very important concepts if you're working with accessibility: how to hide content accessibly and how to label them. So there are currently 4 different ways to hide content using CSS: using the clip path property, using opacity 0, visibility hidden, and display none. Out of these 4, visibility hidden and display none will remove the element that they hide from the DOM and the accessibility tree. Keep this in your mind. They will remove it from the DOM and the accessibility tree, thus making them completely inaccessible. Now, in addition to the CSS properties, we have HTML attributes that also allow us to hide content without needing CSS. So we have the hidden attribute. The hidden attribute is the HTML equivalent of CSS as display none. Content is hidden both visually and from assistive technologies, and it's useful for hiding content when CSS is disabled, such as reader modes. So in reader modes or reading applications, the application is not going to use your own CSS. It's going to take your semantic markup, it needs to be semantic, and it's going to style it the way that makes it more readable for a better user experience. Your styles are not going to be applied or not going to be, and are not going to be used. So if you have an element that you want to hide all the time, no matter whether your CSS is being used or not, you can use the hidden attribute. By the way, this does not work in IE. Now, similar to the hidden attribute is the ARIA hidden attribute. It determines whether an element is hidden from accessibility APIs. So if ARIA hidden is true, the screen reader is not going to see the element. If it's false, it's not hidden. It's useful for hiding decorative or duplicative content, such as icons sitting next to text. So if you have a piece of text or an element or something that is visually part of the design, but it's not very relevant to screen readers, you can hide it from them using the ARIA hidden attribute. So if you have a button that contains both an icon and a piece of text, the icon is redundant, and quick tip, screen reader users hear a lot of announcements all the time, and you want to make sure that they only hear the most important information. Otherwise, it becomes too much. So anything that is redundant, do not announce it. So I have a button here. It's going to be announced as a button, and then I have a piece of text that says menu. That's all my screen reader user needs to know what this button does. In this case, the icon is redundant, it's not relevant, so I'm hiding it using the ARIA hidden attribute. Another attribute that I'm using, that I always use with the ARIA hidden now, is focusable false. Focusable false prevents the icon, the SVG itself, from receiving focus in IE and older versions of Edge. I'm not sure about, well, definitely not Edge Chromium though. So in older versions of Edge and in IE, if you tap to a button that contains an SVG icon, and if you tap, the button is going to receive focus. If you tap again, you expect to move to the second focusable element on the page. But instead, that doesn't happen, so the SVG inside of the button receives focus, which means that your button receives 2 tap stops, and you don't want that to happen. So you prevent that using focusable false. So ARIA hidden can be used to hide content from screen readers while keeping them visually visible. What if you want to do the opposite? What if you want to only hide something visually, like we did with the heading in the main section that we had before? Most of the times, you want to hide, most of the times it's usually for text, and it's done with a utility class like this. This utility class, which I borrowed from my friend Scott O'Hara, he's an accessibility expert. If you want to ask me about him during the break, highly recommend following his work. I've learned 90% of what I know about accessibility from him. So this utility class is essentially shrinking an element into a 1 pixel square, hiding any overflow, and absolutely positioning the element to remove any trace of it from the normal document flow. This class should 99.99% of the time, I'm not sure if it's even 100%, I could probably say 100%, this should only be used to hide text, not interactive elements. If I have some time to cover the last section of the talk, I will, but generally speaking, use this only to hide text, not interactive elements. Okay, so we can hide elements visually only, we can hide elements from screen readers only, and we can hide elements from both. Let's see how these techniques, combined with the labeling, can be used to create icon buttons. accessible icon buttons. So the first technique looks something like this. I would have my button. Inside of it, I have my inline SVG for the icon. And then I can use the screen reader only utility class to provide an accessible name for my button. This is one of the most robust ways to do this. So I have my button. It's going to be announced as a button. I know it's going to be announced as a button. I have my SVG inside, and then I have my piece of text that is used to label the button. Inside of my accessibility DevTools, it's going to look something like this. It has a role button, and the name is menu, and it is inferred from the contents inside of the button. And because the piece of text is used as an accessible label, let me go back again, the icon in this case is again redundant and irrelevant, and it does not need to be announced to screen readers. So again, I'm using aria hidden false and focusable false, aria hidden true and focusable false to hide it from screen readers. So button using the button element, and a name using visually hidden text. Another technique is you can do something like this, and this is one of the most popular techniques. So I have my button element, I have my icon inside of it, and instead of using a piece of text inside of the button to give an accessible name for the button, I'm using aria label. Aria label is similar to aria labeled by. Aria labeled by is used to tell the screen reader, or is used, let me say that another way. Aria labeled by is used to associate another element with the current element and to use that other element as an accessible name or label for this element. Aria label, on the other hand, whatever string you give it inside of the aria label attribute, that is going to be used as an accessible name for the button. This is one of the most popular techniques, especially since whatever you have inside of aria label is going to override everything inside of the button. So if you have a piece of text inside of the button that says banana, it's going to be overridden by aria label, menu. It's going to be announced as menu. Inside of my accessibility tree, I have role button, and the name, the accessible name, is inferred from the aria label attribute. The third technique, which is my personal favorite, combines both this one and the previous one. It combines two techniques, really. So I have a button, I have a piece of text inside of it. Again, I'm not using aria label. And then I have my SVG icon. Because I have a piece of text inside of the button, that piece of text, I can use that as an accessible label for the button. So my SVG is redundant. I'm hiding it using aria hidden. But something to note here is the way that I'm hiding that piece of text. I'm not hiding it using the utility class SR only. I'm hiding it using the hidden attribute. What's the problem with this? Or what could be the problem with this? So the hidden attribute is the HTML equivalent of display none, and display none is supposed to hide an element from the DOM and from screen readers as well. So if the hidden hides the menu, the word menu from screen readers, how is it used as an accessible name? Using aria labeled by. So apparently, something that I learned in the last few months is if you have an element that is hidden from screen readers, if it's not exposed to them, you can still force exposing it. You can still expose it if you reference that element inside of aria labeled by or aria described by. And the benefit of this technique over the previous one is that you make sure that the piece of text is always hidden even when your CSS is not working. And inside of my accessibility tree, I have role button, and the name is inferred from aria labeled by, which is referencing a span that has an ID button label. There are two more techniques that you can use to create accessible icon buttons where you use the icon itself, the SVG itself, in order to create the accessible name of the button. But that is not very consistent across screen reader and browser combinations. So if you want to have a look at those techniques, what the problems with those are, I have an article on my website that you can check out. Now, the ability, why is this information useful? So I've learned about labeling elements and I know about hiding elements accessibly, but sometimes it's just one piece of information that helps you to find a solution for a problem that you wouldn't expect to solve that way. So I want to talk now quickly about infographics and data visualizations. And there's a reason I'm doing this after the previous section. Data visualizations are a great way to make information stand out and sometimes a lot easier to parse and understand. But they also come with their own accessibility challenges that we need to be aware of. When providing information, you want to make sure that that information is available to all your users regardless of how they consume their content. So whether they are cited or not, they should all be able to consume it. Now, when it comes to data visualizations on the web, these visualizations are usually created and presented using SVG. SVG is perfect for creating data visualizations because it comes with all the elements that are needed to create the content of data visualizations. We have circles, we have shapes, we have complex paths, everything. And oftentimes, these images, these visualizations are also interactive and animated, which is also the kind of thing that SVG is perfect for, because everything that you create in an SVG can be animated using CSS and/or JavaScript. For infographics, it's usually JavaScript. But SVG data visualizations are, at the end of the day, SVG images. They're an image, which means that when a screen reader comes across one, it's going to announce that visualization as an image. It's not going to automatically present the information within that image to the user. Presenting the information to the user is part of our responsibility. Now, albeit being a perfect candidate for visually representing information, SVG is not equipped with the semantics needed to convey the content of that information to the user. So any data that you have inside of that visualization is not going to be accessible. This code is from an article by Leonie Watson in which she talks about how you can kind of turn a bar chart into a table inside of an SVG using ARIA roles. So since the table is an appropriate alternative way to represent the information in this particular graph, she was able to use ARIA roles such as roll table, row, etc., to announce the graph as a table to the screen reader with the information inside of that table announced. So because the screen reader now sees a table, it's going to automatically announce the information inside of it, which makes that content kind of accessible. However, the state of SVG accessibility support in browsers and screen readers is still highly inconsistent, even when ARIA is used to polyfill the semantic information. So the long story short is, it's always a good idea to provide an alternative view of the information, for example, by providing a graphical and a tabular view of the content. Now, I've recently worked with Dan Moll and the Super Friendly team to build the 2018 Khan Academy annual report. It's a small website with a big message, and I'm really happy that I got to work on it. The annual report is a report, which means that it contains a lot of information and a lot of data about Khan Academy's use across the globe, their impact, their financial information, and much more. So the site contained quite a bunch of data visualizations and charts, especially on the page titled Leveling the Playing Field. There were a lot of charts. Every chart presented a specific piece or amount of information about a specific topic, and each chart is an SVG. So the first step in implementing the charts for me was choosing an SVG embedding technique. There are currently 7 ways to embed an SVG on a web page. One of them is the embed tag, which is no longer used, which leaves us with 6 main techniques. There are 6 different ways. Each one of them comes with its own pros and cons. When I want to choose an embedding technique, I ask myself a few questions, not just a couple. Is it static? Is it animated? What kind of animation is it? Is it essential, or can I not have it animate in older browsers? Can the animation be done using CSS only? Can it be cross-browser with CSS, or do I need JavaScript? All of these inform which decision I'm going to make. So generally speaking, for charts and data visualizations and infographics, the decision is usually easy. I don't have to even think about it. I always use the object element. So the object element comes with a couple of main advantages. The first one is it allows you to reference an external SVG, which means that no matter how big that infographic or data visualization is, it's going to be cached, and so it's going to be, it makes the website faster on subsequent visits. And it comes with a default fallback mechanism. So anything you put between the opening, closing, and object tags, between the opening and closing object tags is going to be used as a fallback if the SVG fails to load or if the SVG is not supported. Now, so the initial implementation for the data visualizations on the Khan Academy website looked something like this. This is the base markup. I haven't done anything to make it accessible yet. I have an object element. It's referencing an SVG externally. The SVG is called longbeach.svg. And then between the opening and closing tags, I'm providing the text description of the content of that chart. The text description is not always so short. Sometimes it was multiple paragraphs long. And depending on your chart, you may end up putting a table as a fallback for that chart. Okay, so this is a very basic example, but most of the times the fallback was bigger. Now, okay, cool. I needed to test this with a screen reader to see how it's going to announce it. When I did, I was surprised to see that it was announced as a frame, so object was announced as a frame, and it was using the file name as a name, as an accessible name. That's not very useful. So the first thing that I did expect that the name was going to be messed up because it doesn't really have an accessible name here. But I didn't know that it was going to be announced as a frame. So the first thing that I did was I added role image to the object to announce this as an image. And when doing so, I have, so my object is going to be announced as an image, and then I need that image to have an accessible name. Because I cannot put the alt attribute on an object, you need to give it a name. I use the ARIA label. So I gave it a short and succinct title inside of ARIA label and the role image. Now the object was being announced as Khan Academy math usage level in Long Beach, image. That's better, but the screen reader was still not picking up the alternative description of that image. I have the description and it's not being announced, so how does a user know what that chart is representing? Now it seemed to me, at first I was very curious to know, like, would that text be exposed to screen readers because it's part of the markup? No, it wasn't, especially now that I changed the semantics and it was being announced as an image. Now, it seemed that the text was not being announced, but I still needed that text to be exposed and to describe my image. How do I go about doing that? You should know this. ARIA described by, exactly. So all I needed was to add an ID to my fallback content and then tell the screen reader to use that piece of content to describe my image. The difference between ARIA labeled by and ARIA described by is that an ARIA labeled by is used to provide an accessible name to an element. Names should be short and succinct, whereas a description can be longer. The other main difference, which is something that I really like about this, is in the order and the way in which they are announced. So an ARIA labeled by the piece of text, a label is announced before the type of the image. So title or label, image, and then a short pause, and then it announces the description. Now, when the description is announced, it's going to be announced after the element, and if I inspect this inside of the DevTools now, I have an object. It has a role image, and the name, it says, oh, this is a different chart, sorry. So the name is a short and succinct label, and then the description is whatever I have as a fallback between the opening and closing object tags. So, quick recap. In order to create accessible data charts, you need to provide an accessible name for the graph or the chart, provide an alternative view of the information, text, table, whatever, provide a succinct text description of the chart or graph where appropriate or possible, and always make sure there's a differentiation between the title and the description. One more thing, when you're testing with a screen reader, always make sure, or when you're testing your components, the first thing that I always do is whenever I build a component, I don't wait till the end of the project. I test with a screen reader, which is what I did here. And the second thing I do, I test with a keyboard. So whenever I add a component to my page, I start testing with a keyboard. And when I was tabbing through the page, I realized that my tab was being trapped somewhere. So I kept tabbing, and I didn't see where I was on the page, even though I did have focus styles. After a little bit of investigation, I noticed that the object was trapping my focus, because an object is technically an iframe, and so it was trapping my focus. In order to prevent that from happening, I added tab index -1. So tab index -1 prevents an element from being focused, and it also allows you to make it focusable using JavaScript. And that is all I needed to make the accessible data charts for Khan Academy. There is a section that I cannot cover now. It's about interactive elements and how to hide them accessibly. I mentioned before that you use the screen reader only class name to hide text, not interactive elements. If you want, you can ask me about this during the break. It's quite interesting. And you will get the slides, you will get this. That's pretty much it. Thank you.